Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Palo Alto Networks. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you just like to share it with a friend, the on-demand will be made available shortly after the webinar concludes. If you have any questions for our speaker today, go ahead and send those in using the Q&A tab found on the right side of your screen. And if you have any comments to add to our discussion today, or you'd just like to let us know from where you're tuning in, we want you to direct those comments to the chat tab. The PowerPoint slides are available for download if you click the Handouts tab, which can also be found on the right side of your screen. And feel free to download those to follow along throughout today's webinar. And at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So on to our topic. We'll be discussing the least is the most you should do, establishing least privilege access in cloud infrastructure. And I'm joined today by Dan McKenzie, Senior Product Marketing Analyst at Prismacloud, a part of Palo Alto Networks. And Dan, it is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Great. Thanks, Cody. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. As I said, my name is Dan McKenzie, and I'm with the Prismacloud team at Palo Alto Networks, and welcome you to my talk today. And for those of you, I see we got some chats coming in through already. For those of you in the parts of the U.S. that were hit by the winter storms, hope everybody's staying safe. I know when I checked outside today, it felt like it was about -20 where I live. So I'm glad to be here talking with you all instead of dealing with that outside. And as he said, I'm going to talk about privilege access in cloud infrastructure and how you can help enforce least privilege access in your environments. But first, I want to start with something a little bit different. In my personal life, I'm a bit of an amateur architecture buff, especially around modernism in architecture, which I think ties well into our subject. Up here on screen, I have a quote from a fellow by the name of Mies van der Rohe, who was a minimalist architect and last director of the Bauhaus, which is a design school in Europe between the two world wars. And this is kind of a famous quote from Mies, and it really kind of encapsulates his philosophy about how to make greater impact with less design. In the background here, there's a picture of what's called the Farnsworth House outside the city of Chicago in the US. It was built around 1950 or so. It's one of my favorites. And I think it was striking then and probably now, in its simplicity. Mies really felt like this was a living example of his philosophy. And I bring this up because it sometimes seems like, especially in cloud computing, the opposite is true, where more is more. And it breaks my heart a little bit sometimes. And what I mean by that can be seen in a couple of trends that I have up on screen here around cloud infrastructure. So first is that we know organizations are adopting more clouds or more cloud providers, really. 93% of all organizations are multi-cloud, whether by choice or by force, through acquisitions and mergers. But we are seeing that most organizations are taking on, multiple cloud providers for whatever reason. And then within those cloud providers and within those services, we know, obviously, DevOps and microservices are making things go faster. Some of the stats that we see, and I'm sure this changes, given any quarter, but the last data we had was about 55% of teams are releasing weekly. And, we know that some are going every day or even multiple times a day. And then, within all of this, we know that there are more services and more features along with all of these infrastructure as a service services and offerings. And along with those also means more entitlements or more permissions and access. And I have a little stat up there from Gartner, who recently stated that on average now, there are more than 5,000 different possible entitlements for any given cloud service provider. So when you log in, your users, or if you are the user, your admin has more than 5,000 on any given cloud provider. So if we go back to the start, if you're on multiple clouds, that's really kind of starting to explode in terms of the number of entitlements that people might have. Before we continue, though, it's important to understand what these entitlements are for those who don't know. It's really just sets of permissions that give users access to accounts and services. It's pretty straightforward. But we generally break them down into 3 groups. At least I do want to talk about them. And that's first is at the resource level, and these are functional work for reading and writing, configuring resources, things like that. Above that is your your service level, and this is more operational work. Starting and stopping instances, creating and cloning things, running load balancers, and then above that or below it, however you want to think about it, is the management level. Administrative work, security settings, billing, account creation. In our case, and all of these different types of entitlements and the number of entitlements are necessary. It's important to set hierarchies within your environments. You need to be able to reduce risk, and so they are really powerful. But at the same time, they can be kind of dangerous to a certain extent. And what I mean by that is that they are difficult to manage at times, and especially in the cloud, with such explosive growth in the number of entitlements, they become very difficult to manage. And that's going back to what I said in the opening, where this maximalist or this more and more approach kind of begins to break down in cloud. And it kind of breaks down across 3 areas where we see organizations really start to have troubles managing things. And the first is just basic visibility across your cloud service providers or whatever your dashboards are. It's hard to see from a single location what a single user can do across different service providers, or even what users are able to access a given resource. Likewise, mapping, if you have an SSO or single sign-on solution, mapping your identities from single sign-on roles out to cloud roles can be difficult. It's possible, but it's very difficult. And you can't really, take everything together and to be able to see, what that net effect is, or what people are able to do at the end of the day. Those net permissions, it's hard because you can't do risk analysis across all of those. Governance becomes difficult. If you can't see, you don't know what needs to be controlled. You can't understand if permissions are excessive for a given user, and this is exacerbated by the conflicting definitions across cloud service providers. Different CSPs might have similar types of roles, but they might define it differently, or IAM governance roles kind of function differently across a lot of the service providers. And so for people who don't have that kind of specialized knowledge, it's difficult to track across the different services. And then finally, and I've been kind of saying this all along, but it's this sheer complexity and scale of these environments that becomes difficult. Multi-cloud instances, tracking for human and non-human roles. As I said earlier, there's thousands of different entitlements possible. And really, the worst part is that all of this excess isn't necessarily helping anyone. It can be necessary, but it's not helping anyone. Another quote from that same report from Gartner earlier, showing that more than 95% of accounts in infrastructure service use on average less than 3% of the entitlements they're granted. So not only are there way too many, people aren't even using the ones that they have. And that's just increasing risk, increasing your attack surface across your environment. So how do we simplify? How can organizations address this mismatch between the number of entitlements that are available or already in use, and the need to minimize access, when securing cloud environments and protecting privileged access? So in keeping with my metaphor from earlier, I will invoke a good friend, Mies van der Rohe again here. On the left, you can see, probably what is a very well designed, but maybe excessive kind of castle in the French style. And on the right is another view of the Farnsworth House. So if you remember from the beginning, Mies's goal was to reduce a structure down to its minimum parts, while still maintaining beautiful design and practical usability. And that's really our same goal here, right? Our users need the practical ability to access infrastructure resources without hurdles, but we need to be able to reduce the amount of entitlements needed to do so down to the bare minimum, what's known as that least privilege, or that least privilege access, giving users the minimum amount of permissions needed to do their work. And within cloud security and cloud native development, what you're starting to see are solutions for what's known as cloud infrastructure entitlement management. You might see the acronym CIEM, or people pronounce it different ways, and there's varying terms for it now that it's kind of starting to become more available. But Gartner coined this particular term, and you can kind of see in the visual on the right there, kind of consider it as a subset of cloud security posture management, meaning where if cloud security posture management, or CSPM, is focused more on configuring resources, then that CIM is kind of that next level down, where it's focused more specifically on identity configurations. And these solutions offer value in a couple of different ways. First and foremost is just offering that basic visibility into entitlements, knowing what can entitlement do for a person, what can a given user access, what users can access a resource, things like that. They help you right-size permissions. So not only do they show just what's out there, they should be able to show you, is that set of entitlements, or is that specific access, is it correct? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Is it outdated? And you'll also find a number of advanced analytics, meaning different ways to analyze this data and kind of make some analysis and connect it to different parts of data, within your environments. And then lastly, this also ties into a number of different compliance needs depending on the organization. So being able to detect and remediate drift in your permissions, and likewise setting up automation to keep things intact or remediate some of the issues that we have. And specifically what I'm talking about here today is within for Prisma Cloud. Offers this functionality and more. CIEM solutions are integrated into the platform just like our other functionality. And we provide deep visibility into those effective permissions across CSPs, meaning from within Prisma Cloud, you can see what a user can do across AWS or Azure. We're able to ingest the entitlements, roles and permissions, and calculate that net outcome, that net effective permission for what a user can do. We also give the ability to run queries against the data, integrate with SSO providers. And then with that information, you can establish reliable controls and governance, setting different policies for your users, running compliance reports, analysis, which I'll get into in just a second here. And then really overall, just being able to enforce this least privilege access, both through sort of system-generated recommendations on how to get a user back into a state of least privilege, as well as automated remediation, to a certain extent, if your environment would allow for that. And so you're probably saying to yourself, that's great, but what does this look like in practice? We'll dive a little bit deeper into some of these features and functionalities. We have, so as I said earlier, at its base, we provide that visibility into these net effective permissions. Prisma Cloud allows you to automatically calculate net effective permissions out of various types of policies within your cloud accounts, giving you that control over those entitlements. We have special out-of-the-box policies used to detect public access. If there's wildcards being used in any of your identities, any other sort of risky permissions, however you define that, being able to sort of view those and control for those. Governance across different permissions to be able to prevent entitlement drift. And then, as I said, removing that unwanted access by detecting those excessive or overly permissive policies. One of the nice features within Prisma Cloud is the ability to query your identity data. So once you ingest it, it's sort of in the system for you to use, and we have what's called Resource Query Language, RQL. It's a natural language, query language within Prisma Cloud. In using that, you can query this data and find out the relationships among all of your different permissions. And like I said earlier, this is where you would really use to figure out what action a user can take against different resources. Whatever kind of information you want to ask of your data, you could pretty much do. And then the real nice thing is that you can take those queries and you can actually turn them into sort of custom cloud agnostic policies, including we will generate the remediation steps and the compliance implications, but you can also have those in there as well. Within your larger environments, we also integrate with different identity providers. So like Okta and Azure Active Directory, and that's to ingest your user data as you're mapping how those users access and their paths of access to your different cloud accounts. And then as well, using that data to then inform effective permissions and looking at your cloud identities as human and machine identities as well. I mentioned earlier some of these advanced analytics. One of the things that Prisma Cloud has user entity behavior analytics, or UEBA. And it's really just a system that helps you monitor your cloud environments. It sets sort of a baseline for behavior across all of your users or for a given user. And then using machine learning, the system can then generate an alert based on what it thinks is perhaps an anomaly or a risky behavior from a given user or identity. And then I mentioned earlier automated remediation as well. You can automatically adjust permissions from within Prisma Cloud, or you can also then send those alert notifications to your third-party tool of choice, basically. I mean, we've got a number listed here, but yeah, wherever you're pulling your information from, we can kind of generate that for you. Excellent. Right. So I see real quick question in the chat here from Wilson. UEBA is not a term from Gartner. That is for us there, and we can find more information about that on the Prisma Cloud website as well if you're interested. Okay. And actually, that's a good transition. I want to open it up into the floor. Keeping it pretty quick today, as I know, we could have gone in and kind of get pretty deep, but I want to open it up to the floor and see if we have any additional questions from the cloud or from the crowd looking into least privileged access or Prisma Cloud as well. Okay, nothing from the crowd. Cody, do you see anything coming in on your end as well here? Any questions from the crowd?
So I do have a question right here, and so it states, what's the functional difference between PAM and CIEM?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a little bit confusing. I mean, the PAM, or the Privileged Access Management, is what that stands for. PAM and CIEM overlap to a certain extent, and I would say it's not so much an either or. It's kind of they're more different stations along the spectrum. As a methodology, PAM and CIEM really have the same goals, trying to control access and minimize risk. But when it comes specifically to software tools and solutions, what you typically see is that PAM tools were or sort of stem from or been designed more for use with on-premises systems, where CIEM solutions are typically designed more for use in the cloud. But if you have a specific PAM solution, chances are it might do a little bit of the functionality the CIEM solution does, and vice versa. A CIEM solution probably covers a lot of what PAM does as well. Good question. Thank you.
Awesome. So, here's another one. So what information is Prisma Cloud actually using to calculate the effective permissions?
Yeah, so I'd say the very short, maybe unsatisfying answer is that it's a proprietary algorithm that does the work. But sort of within that, there's two main pieces that go into it. The first is Prisma Cloud ingests the role, policy, group data, et cetera, from your onboarded cloud accounts. And then it reconciles all of those to get that effective permission by whatever lens you want to view it in. For example, like if you're looking at what a given user can do in AWS, it calculates all of the different permissions, what it allows you to do, what it blocks you to do, and kind of spits that out. That's where that calculation comes from. Along with that, though, there's also sort of like a time frame or time variable where it's matching actual usage. So like when an entitlement was actually last used, was that last week, was it 6 months ago? And so then and sort of those two together give you that effective permissions and how it sort of ranks what kind of that risk it is in terms of like whether it's outdated or too much, making the assumption that if it hasn't been used, it's probably too much. Now, the specific details on what data is ingested, when I say like role, policy, group data, all of that, that is available in our documentation, which is publicly accessible as well, just docs.paloaltonetworks.com. Yeah.
Great. So that was docs@paloalto.com.
Yeah, docs.paloaltonetworks.com. And from there, there's you do a search for, IAM security, identity security. The actual address, I'm sure, is probably way too long to list out for the crowd here. So.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So here's another question. Is it possible to use Prismacloud for microsegmentation into the cloud as it does for Kubernetes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It's so the microsegmentation functionality is not necessarily directly, it's not necessarily that same functionality for identities, but it in terms of being able to control communications and sort of see visibility across cloud accounts. That same type of control is there, but the underlying functionality is slightly different. Prisma Cloud is, we sometimes market it with different sets of functionality, but it's all more or less on the exact same platform. So if you are using microsegmentation already within Prisma Cloud, all of this functionality is just right there, within the same UI. I hope that answered the question.
Now our next question reads, how quickly does Prismacloud generate an alert once an identity policy has been violated?
So the average is just a few minutes. That varies based on the specific policy that we're talking about and the customer's or the user's specific environment, but it averages out to be just a couple of minutes. So once that that violation has occurred or a risk is seen in the system, you'll know within pretty quickly and certainly enough time to do something about it.
Yeah. So that is all the questions I'm seeing right now. Do you have anything further that you would like to direct our audience to before we move to wrap things up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned, I think, both of these earlier, but if you want to dig deeper into these features, obviously we would love to provide a specific demo for you. Of course, you can request that from our site, paloaltonetworks.com/prisma/cloud. And then I mentioned this earlier about our technical documentation, docs.paloaltonetworks.com, if you really kind of want to get deep into things and see how that works.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing this presentation, sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. It was great to talk with everyone today.
Sure. Just a quick reminder for our audience that this session was recorded. So following the conclusion of the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find this recording living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars. Real quick, we have 4 winners for our $25 Amazon gift card drawing. Our first winner is Harris A. Our second winner is Rind A. Our third winner is Paulo M. And our fourth winner is Wilson M. So congratulations to the 4 winners today. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive that email, just check your spam folder. I would like to send our gratitude to Palo Alto Networks for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. I really appreciate you being here with us for this TechStrong webinar. Please take a second to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future webinar.